Quite well, si additional cost, quite noted. Which kitchen man do, which maybe Wabo, which Jojo Key. I just introduced myself and Algonquin and announced my Algonquin name, Walamsi. I've also given thanks to the Creator, to wisdom keepers, both male and female, who have come before us. I'm also welcoming you to Algonquin territory, but it's more than a territory. It's also an ancestral lands that for a long, long time, my ancestors have taken care of the land and the water. And it's a fundamental part of everything that we do, including providing our food for ourselves. I recognize that the spirit of the water and the land, of which we are connected. In fact, a recent 4-day conference here in Ottawa, the Canadian Advisory Reserve Association, in which Indigenous peoples came from coast to coast to coast from throughout Canada. We decided to make a promise to help the Canadian Advisory Reserve Association. And we said we are voices of the land and the water, that we are those sacred elements held together by natural law. And I remember Elder William Comenda, before he passed away, who received an honorary doctorate from this institution, always spoke about our connectiveness, our first responsibility to care for continuation of creation. And so those are fundamental values that are part of the Algonquin Nation that we celebrate and happily share with all of you, those of you present in this room, and the many, I understand, 200 of you who have tuned in through webinar. That's amazing what technology can do. It also reminds me of a process on the Convention University called Pathway to One. And sometime next week, reports emanating from the steering committee representing Canada, the provinces and territories, the Indigenous Circle of Experts, and the National Advisory Panel will be tabled. But of course, I can't reveal recommendations before they're given to ministers. But suffice it to say that co-governance, that sharing Indigenous oral traditions and Western business model are part of that experience. And I know yesterday I was in a place called Long Sioux with about 75 farmers, and we opened that session with a smudge. Everybody got in a circle and we did the smudge. One of the things that Dr. Reg Groshue, who is the senior elder with Pathways One, talks about, the smudge and the gavel are equivalent. Robert's Rules of Order and the 7 grandmother-grandfather teachings that are expressed as ethical spaces and coined by Cree elder Willie Erman helped guide creating a sacred space in which cross-cultural work was achieved. And I think it's becoming much more, certainly of the circles that I've been operating in. And so it's the spirit of that shared cultural diversity that I'm honored to share today. And if I may, I'm going to touch on a little bit of history. That the Canadian Constitution Act in 1982 was created as a result, in part, of Indigenous elders. Dr. Reg Groshue was one of them. And they brought up the wampum mills the pipes and the ceremonies and influenced what became Section 35 of the Constitution, recognizing Indigenous rights, but the underpinning of those rights are the responsibilities to the land. And when those responsibilities are exercised, then all of our descendants benefit. And so that is also an important message. And so today, we have that opportunity in the spirit of how foundational relationships were built in 1764, culminating from the Proclamation of 1763, which is incorporated in the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982. And at the Treaty of Niagara, between 2,000 and 2,500 chiefs came from 24 nations and came from as far away as a travel that took them over 3 months one way. And they spent two months, sunrise to sunset, sharing ceremonies. The Crown had the capacity to speak Indigenous languages, understood the protocols around Indigenous ceremonies, and produced and shared a welcome. I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. But so it's on that basis, and given Ottawa's role as a capital city, I had the great privilege of spending decades working with Elder William Commanda and approaching cross-culturally issues like food, caring for the land, etc. So with that, I'll close out this opening by thanking all of you for attending and bringing your special guests. Thanking Fiji Metadu for our safe journey here, and honoring the fact that our families are, in many cases, keeping the home fires burning while we come together and share this important topic. So I say Judy wish to all of you, and I look forward to our discussions. Very much.
Thank you, Larry, for starting us off today, welcoming us to your territory, to Algonquin territory, on which University of Ottawa is based, and also Carleton University, my home institution. My name is Peter Andre, and I teach political science at Carleton. And the purpose of today's session for the next 2 hours is really to talk about governance of food policy for Canada. As you know, the federal government has been working over the last year and longer internally to think about what should a food policy for this country look like. And we are here in broad strokes to talk about that, but I think to focus attention on the question of governance. A food policy is only going to be as good as the parts that lead to its implementation. And that means co-implementation, not only by federal government, but hopefully with buy-in from provinces and territories, municipal governments, and other stakeholders, far and wide, industry and civil society, and so on. And so when we talk about governance today, I think we can think about it on several different levels. There's the internal mechanisms within the federal government in order for departments and agencies to be really working effectively together on a common set of objectives. There is the cross-governmental piece around how the provinces and territories fit in, and underneath that, municipalities as well, who are already very engaged in food policy. So there's got to be a way to link in with them. And then, as I mentioned, there's the question of multi-stakeholder engagement and how a food policy for Canada can be owned in some way by industry and civil society and the other stakeholders, so that they are working together on achieving some of its objectives. Because, as we know, a food policy is about integration. It's about whole of government, but it's also about whole of society in the end, if the objectives are to be realized. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I think Diana will give us a little more of a background on the food policy story in Canada. What I want to do right now is just introduce the panelists that we have today for this discussion. Beginning with, we'll start with Diana Bronson.
Executive Director of Food Secure Canada, which is a pan-Canadian alliance of organizations and individuals working to achieve zero hunger, healthy and safe food, and sustainable food systems. Trained as a political scientist and sociologist, and has worked in journalism, international human rights, and at international climate and technology negotiations at the UN. And Food Secure Canada, who Diana represents, along with the Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton that I'm associated with, are the co-hosts of this event, together with a research project called Suffice. And we also want to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding to bring this group together today. So Diana and I as co-hosts, we'll start this piece, and then the rest of the panel is Dr. Lauren Baker will go next. She's been working for 20 years on food issues ranging from researching agricultural biodiversity in Mexico to negotiating and developing municipal food policies and programs, in particular serving as coordinator of the Toronto Food Policy Council. She's consulted on farm to fork. At least neither of those are bad words. Farm to fork initiatives and food system policy development across Canada and globally. Following Lauren, we'll hear from Don Buckingham. Dr. Don Buckingham is CEO of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. He's taught agricultural and food law at several Canadian universities. He's co-author of Agricultural Law in Canada and author of Food Regulation in Canada, and previously served as chair of the Canada Agricultural Review Tribunal. Next up will be Pat Moon. In 1977, Pat co-founded the Rural Advancement Fund International, RAFI, later renamed the ETC Group. He received the Right Livelihood in the Swedish Parliament in 1985 and the Pearson Peace Prize from Canada's Governor-General in 1998. And he's co-author of several books on the politics of biotechnology and biodiversity. And he's widely regarded as an authority on issues of global governance, corporate concentration, and intellectual property monopoly. And then finally, we'll hear from Larry again. Larry McDermott, who's a member of Shabat Abadjawan First Nation. Larry served as an Ontario municipal politician for 28 years, including as the first national rural chair of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. He's currently executive director of Plenty Canada, a nonprofit organization devoted to environmental protection in healthy communities. And then we have one other person joining us who is not able to be here because her flight was canceled yesterday out of Nova Scotia due to the bad weather, the nor'easter that hit the East Coast. So Dr. Kathy Ma is a medical doctor and associate professor in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University. She's also appointed at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Dr. Ma directs Dalhousie's Food Policy Lab, a multidisciplinary program of research on environmental and policy determinants of healthier consumption with a focus on health-promoting innovations in the food system. So I'm going to pass it on to these folks. I had the pleasure of connecting with all these people over the last few weeks to set this up, and now I get to leave the stage and leave it to them to present to you from different perspectives on these questions of governance, and then I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. We have up until 12 o'clock, so there should be plenty of time for Q&A from the audience that's here in the room. For those of you who are online, please type in questions through the chat box, and then Amanda's going to be in the back of the room there, and she will help ferry them up to the front, and we'll make sure that they get addressed to the mic, and that folks online are part of the conversation as well. So, and thank you all for those in person for being here. So I'll pass it on to Diana.
Thanks so much, Peter, for all the work that you put into this and all the support you give to Food Secure Canada and our efforts to get a national food policy that reflects the values you spoke to in the introduction. So I guess if I just put my finger up, Nicole, you can change the slide. Is that the way it will work? Yeah? Okay, so go ahead. So Peter already explained a little bit who Food Secure Canada is, so I won't go over that, but suffice it to say that we've been working towards a national food policy for Canada for the past 10 years, since the launch of the People's Food Policy Project back in 2008 and the Eat, Think, Vote campaign in 2015, when we called upon candidates from all parties, thank you, to support a national food policy, and we've done many, many different engagements over the years, community discussions. We're very convinced that ordinary citizens and people in the nonprofit sector have an enormous amount to contribute to the substance of a national food policy. So just reviewing the questions that came in as people registered, there were some very basic questions. So I just want to be clear that a few things that have happened in the timeline so far. So the mandate was given by Prime Minister Trudeau to Agriculture Minister Lawrence Macaulay in his mandate letter in November of 2015, giving him the mandate to develop a national food policy that would put more healthy Canadian food on the plates of Canadian families. And we urged at that time that the government take an interdepartmental approach, which they did, with up to 16 different government departments around the table at various times. So it took them quite some time, I would say, to launch consultations, about 18 months, and that led to a very intense process that took place last summer, online consultations, a food summit where about 300 of us gathered in Ottawa, events across the country organized by MPs, by community groups, and by the government itself. And we now wait for the What We Heard report out of those consultations. So I know there's people from Agriculture Canada in the room. Maybe they'll be in a position to share some news on that, because a lot of us contributed, about 40,000 people online, and we'd really like to know what the government actually heard. And according to the timelines we've been giving, we're expecting a national food policy, or a food policy for Canada, to be announced before the summer. So when all of this was going on, Food Secure Canada, we put forward five big ideas for the national food policy. Was that me who did that? Not sure. There we go, thank you. And I won't go into all of them because we don't have time. The fifth big idea was to get more voices at the table, and in particular the voices that have been excluded thus far from food policy making, which has been largely in the domain of industry and government, with very little participation from ordinary citizens, from Indigenous people, from people living in food insecurity, from certainly some aspects of the farming community. So food policy governance is complicated, and we identified this as a very critical aspect of the food policy to work on, that we get some kind of a forum where these discussions can continue to happen, and not merely a policy that would be a piece of paper that would sit on a shelf and not be applied. So there's a number of challenges. I've put some of them up on the slide here. As we all know, food issues are complex. There are multiple levels and different nodes of decision-making inside government and in other places in society. There are different imperatives even within government, as we have seen between health and agriculture. Despite the good work that has been done for those two departments to be working together, they respond to different imperatives and different constituencies. And the same could be said of many other departments, be it INAC, environment, trade, fisheries and oceans, or any other department. There are real issues of transparency and inclusion having to do with intellectual property, capacity to influence decision-making, access to decision-making, access to the right level of decision-making. The economic growth objectives that the Government of Canada has fixed through the Barton Report and the identification of agriculture and agri-food as a prime sector of growth and export growth for the Canadian economy poses challenges in terms of what we're thinking of as sustainable food systems. And then there's just massive issues around trust and communications and how we work together and begin to work in a more united direction. So starting in about last March, a group of people out of Maple Leaf Food, Food Secure Canada, the RL Food Institute at the University of Guelph, CAPI, Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Dietitians of Canada, a number of academics, including Peter Andre and Rod McRae and many others, decided to sit down and see what we might be able to do together. And we came up with a series of recommendations on governance that were a consensus amongst the group. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, the idea of creating a new National Food Policy Council, and most of my remarks are going to focus on that. And secondly, some of the short-term recommendations to improve food policy governance in Canada in general. And finally, some considerations of long-term objectives, and I'll just be very brief on those 2 and 3. So I think Lauren will explain in a bit more detail the mechanics of food policy councils, which are very much a Canadian invention. There's about 80 of them in Canada right now, perhaps more. But while we were exploring all the inventory of governance recommendations that we would have, it was pretty clear quite quickly that people zeroed in on the National Food Policy Council as the best idea. Why? So I would see this, now these are the recommendations that we jointly submitted to the government, and I'm going to give you a bit of a Food Secure Canada spin on them because we agreed on some things, but not necessarily everything. But first of all, the mandate, what you see on the screen here is exactly what we submitted to the government, and you can also go read about it in more detail on our website. So one of the purposes would be to align purpose, expertise, and actions, basically to get people together from different sectors and different areas working together. To act as an independent advisory body to government. Government will remain in the driver's seat on the critical decisions, but this is to advise the government. To work to build consensus and engagement across stakeholder groups. So what can we agree upon? And where could we get some rapid actions on things that we actually agree upon? It could also be a place to commission research and expertise that would inform government policy making, making sure that what the new National Food Policy Council would commission would be relevant policy making process. This one I think is really critical to provide a regular venue for where these different sectors can meet together. And all the details on that remain to be worked out. So people from the corporate sector, small, medium, large, people from the non-profit sector, academics or research institutions, different government departments and different levels of government could all have roles in this in this body, which would facilitate such dialogues through working groups, through annual conferences. There's a number of ideas. We could actually set up benchmarks once the government announces its new food policy. We could set up benchmarks by which that food policy could be evaluated, and that would be done on a consensus basis. It would be independently done. It would have to provide some support to resource constrained stakeholders, and I'm talking mostly about the charitable and nonprofit sector there, that there would be a fund upon which people could draw in order to have meaningful participation. It could facilitate the coordination of activities, stop useless duplication and redundancies in the kinds of activities we're doing, and potentially could have a funding mandate. I had the personal experience of working for a paragovernmental institution by the name of Rights and Democracy, and it actually did many of these things in a mandate that was independent of government, but was a creature of government, and it reported to Parliament. So in Food Secure Canada's view, the bringing into being of such an institution should actually be created by an act of Parliament, and it is to Parliament that this institution should respond, not to a minister. Again, tons of details to be worked out later. Peter mentioned in his intervention some of the other co-governance options that we've talked about. Interdepartmental food policy committees comprised of deputy ministers under the Privy Council leadership, with a food policy secretariat housed right in the PCO. That's a pretty ambitious goal, but if food truly is a priority for this government, something worth thinking. Possibly a council of ministers, obviously and necessarily a nation-to-nation, Crown-to-Inuit process on food, and a lot of details remain to be worked out on that. this group that was together, we did not have the pretension of trying to solve all of those issues. And then on the longer term, how about a cabinet committee on food and food security, or a federal department of food, or perhaps a Canada Food Act, like we have a Canada Health Act that enunciates the principles that inform our food, and that would not be subject to this government or that government and little change and election and pop, we change everything, but that would have a more ongoing life as we can think of in the case of the Canada Health Act. So what was really interesting, and I'm winding up here, is the number of groups that got involved in the discussions around this policy, and then the number who signed on afterwards. So I've just flashed up some of the logos of those organizations, but you can see a pretty wide perspective, a wide variety of groups from the agricultural sector, from the processing sector, food industry, from the charitable sector, and I didn't mention philanthropic organizations, but they were also very instrumental in this under the leadership of the McConnell Foundation, and NGOs and others. So wide variety of support. So I'm hoping today is, well, it's actually probably the second or third discussion we're having on governance, because we've had a number of them within the membership of Food Secure Canada. But what happens today and how we build on the discussions that we're having today will continue at our assembly in November, and I urge everyone to consider coming to that event. We hope to have many open discussions. There's lots of things to work out about this. And I invite you, if you're not already, to join our listserv, become a member, or join our social media feeds. So I'll wind it up there, Larry, if that's okay.
So much for prescient thinking. I should have brought the mic to the chair with me. Thank you, Diana. My wheels are spinning already. Our next speaker is Dr. Baker.
Thank you for hosting this conversation, Peter, for all your work organizing it. Welcome to all of you who are joining us online. And Larry, I just wanted to say thank you for welcoming us to your ancestral territory. As a settler, that means a lot to me. And also for your ongoing partnership. I mean, we've worked together for many years on these issues, and I've learned a lot through that work. And so in the context of cross-cultural dialogue and exchange, that's been really important to me, and hope we can continue to build on that important conversation that we've had. So today I wanted to address how we harness the collective intelligence of all of those who have a stake in food across the country through what we're creating, what we hope to create around a new mechanism or a new governance structure, and in relation to the national food policy for Canada. And we have an imperative to do this, to explore new governance structures and mechanisms, especially in consideration of the complexity of the issues at hand. We are facing crises in land use and climate change and finance, poverty, economic development, and how do we sort of take an integrated approach to solving these problems? And I think a National Food Policy Council can play an important role. Fundamentally important for effective food policy development at the federal level will be a strong partnership between, Diana kind of sketched this out already, between elected leaders, across government, civil society, all the actors, business, farmers, et cetera, the list is long, as well as a strong secretariat and active support from staff across ministries, and this idea of food systems thinking. So these are all things that will be fundamentally important to us as we move forward with this idea. And so what I wanted to do through my contribution today was reflect on the lessons that I've learned, the lessons I learned as coordinator of the Toronto Food Policy Council, and how some of those lessons can be applicable to the conversation about a National Food Policy Council. So just very briefly, the Toronto Food Policy Council is formally linked to Toronto government. Toronto City Council is a subcommittee to the Board of Health. And where this sits, and Diana talked about this, where this sits matters. So, we can explore that, and I know others are actively exploring that. I just wanted to say where it sits matters. And the members consist of elected officials and stakeholders from across the food system, supported by a small secretariat embedded in City of Toronto staff, as City of Toronto staff. And the mandate that Diana put up on the screen in terms of the National Food Policy Council really reflects the mandate of the Toronto Food Policy Council as well, to advise and support Toronto in the development of inclusive and comprehensive food security policies and programs, advocate for innovative community food security programs that address citywide priorities, foster dialogue across the city, across community groups, social agencies, educational institutions, and businesses, act as a community reference group for the Toronto Food Strategy. So that's the formal mandate of the Toronto Food Policy Council. To me, there are sort of two central questions that I want to explore through the potential role for a Food Policy Council. And the first is, how can a National Food Policy Council connect and leverage the broad range of policies and programs across jurisdictions to amplify beneficial effects? So there's an idea of linking, connecting, leveraging, and amplifying. How can we achieve that through a National Food Policy Council? And then secondly, how can the National Food Policy Council serve and support the federal government with its food policy agenda? And when I was coordinator of the Food Policy Council, I reminded the council members frequently that this was the role, that they're there to serve and support and advise the City of Toronto government on the formation of food policy. There are, I think, three kind of overarching roles. Diana sketched some of these out, three overarching roles for a Food Policy Council. And I want to go through each of these really quickly with some concrete examples of how it worked in the Toronto context. So the first is facilitate connections and understanding across sectors, regions, perspectives, and knowledge in support of change. And this speaks, I think, to this kind of idea of cross-cultural exchange and dialogue that Larry mentioned. There is a big need, and all of you working on these issues understand this, to build cross-sectoral understanding and really important opportunities related to collaboration. So at its best, the Food Policy Council will not only impact government and support the government, but also impact the stakeholders around the table to work differently and to collaborate in new ways. And this is what we see in the Toronto context, that the benefits of collaboration extend far beyond advice and input to government. And in this sense, it leverages all of those stakeholders toward those broader policy priorities. And I think this is what we need to think of when we're thinking of moving forward with these issues. Earlier, I was speaking to someone who asked me, how do we then link up all this great work that's happening at municipal levels? In Canada, we now have a very robust infrastructure of provincial food policy networks. And so how do we link all of these up into the national food policy? And there are already, burgeoning kind of fledgling mechanisms for this. For example, Sustain Ontario, which is Ontario's food policy network, has a municipal food policy working group. So, can we see these kinds of tiered linkages where that working group would then bring advice and ideas to the provincial group into the federal process. So the second role for a national food policy council would be framing, and this is the idea of food systems framing, kind of thinking beyond individual issues and thinking systemically across sectors, problems, and traditional program areas. So framing up new priorities. One quick example was some work that the Toronto Food Policy Council did around jobs. and employment. So when we think about employment, we're usually using the North American Industry Classification System, which classifies jobs in silos. But then when you look at food as a sector, you begin to realize in Canada, more than 1 in 10 jobs is related to the food system. And this is an incredibly important sector to pay attention to develop, to think systematically about. So it's fresh framing, thinking about food as critical urban infrastructure because of the extensive food assets that we have across the country and valuing those. So framing is really important, framing, systemic framing. And then the final role, of course, is around policy and practice. So the Food Policy Council can play an incredible role around important role around analyzing, influencing, and creating policy. And there are a whole set of functions and things that the food policy can contribute to related to creating visions and overarching policy directions related to food systems, developing policy proposals, participating in regulatory processes as advocates, drafters, or consultants. There's a whole kind of suite of ways that collective intelligence can be facilitated to participate in the policy-making process. And this is, in my mind, about promoting policy coherence across ministries and about that work, that long-term work of creating a coherent and inclusive food policy framework. So maybe that's related to your kind of food act that you talked about, Diana. So in conclusion, there are challenges, of course, moving forward. So where the Food Policy Council sits, it's a challenge to figure out. There are different ideas for this. We need to do some hard thinking about that. I think also another challenge is to ensure that members of this new multi-stakeholder body aren't just representing the position of their constituencies, but bringing their best advice to the table, their best advice to government, their best advice to their peers in this work. There's a challenge around setting up a secretariat that works effectively and can work across the priorities of the council, that can work as a partner to the government with ministries as they think about their priorities, and a secretariat that can deeply understand and translate the different mandates, the different interests, and the risks, real and perceived, that different stakeholders have around the table, and that's a crucial role. So the goal of the secretariat should be to facilitate these linkages and build mutual understanding. The opportunity is for the Food Policy Council to act as a nexus for food systems and analysis and interventions at the federal level. And it's really exciting to be having this conversation with all of you, and I look forward to the question and answer period. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. I'll turn things over to Don.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. And I echo the comments of Lauren that it's just a real pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you for the invitation. We're all connected, and we go back to the ancestral lands of the Algonquin people, the settlers who have come, the university that has grown up on this property. And so I thank Peter and Diana for the activities that they're propelling us into the future. And what's more important than food? We all eat 3 times a day, and when we don't, there are consequences. And so from my analysis, one of the real opportunities and one of the challenges is to take a look at a very important part of any kind of food policy, and that's food making. So really in my role as CAPI CEO now is to take a look at how we as a non-governmental independent organization can be a facilitator of dialogue around food and agriculture. So when the opportunity came to be part of a dialogue on food or on a national food policy, or even more precisely on a national food policy council, it strikes me that this is exactly the time and place for organizations like CAPI who can bring people together for dialogue. So thank you for including me in this day. When it comes to food and food policy, I think it's important not to we go. It's important to understand that we're in the 21st century, and a friend of mine says the problem with instant gratification is it's just not fast enough anymore. So the changes are getting faster, they're more frequent, they're more complex, and it just makes this idea of a national food policy more challenging. So there are a number of things that I've called hot potatoes and cold cuts that make this a very, very dynamic, interesting, but challenging area. So we live in a complex sandbox around food. We have consumers, governments, First Nations, NGOs, universities, foundations, producers, all wanting to be engaged. Now, they don't often all want to be engaged at the same time in the same place, but one of the great things that we've been noticing is that the national food policy conversation has given us a venue, an opportunity on several occasions to see people in a room who often aren't in the same room. And that's been a huge benefit that we have already seen some of the fruit from. We have production agriculture, so those people who are out on the land producing, gathering, we have some interesting challenges there. There's a big movement for what's called generically identification preservation, and that is everything from identifying organic foods to identifying value-added products. This is not something that we knew in the past. If you grew up in Saskatchewan like I did, you produced wheat, your wheat looked like the next guy's wheat, looks like the next gal's wheat, and it all kind of looked the same. That wasn't really a big issue. But consumers now are demanding that we have different kinds of products, even at the production level. The other thing that is big on the minds of farmers right now is the whole idea of natural capital. Is my land going to be as productive 10 years from now? And this is echoing something that Larry said. It's always been a concern of the Algonquin people that the land would continue to be productive generation after generation. And that's certainly a concern that we have to look for in a food policy and an agriculture policy. And then we have consumer concerns, healthy, nutritious food, and we have concerns of the vulnerable, access to food. And now we've also had an initiative from the federal government which recognizes agriculture as an economic generator. So a national food policy could not come soon enough. We have to have a whole food system analysis. We have to be able to encourage people to get together for dialogue, and there has to be a spirit of cooperation. So what I wanted to bring to the table is that it's important to remember that there's a huge contribution, and I think Lauren just made reference to the contribution of agriculture as an ability to enable people to have income to buy food. So if they're not producing it, there's still a lot of people in the system who are using the agri-food system as a means of employment, which will then in turn allow them to purchase their food. So this slide is a little schematic about 2 million jobs in Canada relate to agriculture and agri-food sectors. Everything from the inputs at the top through the production in primary agriculture down to the food processing and processing, over to food retail, and finally into food services. In fact, the food processing sector is the biggest manufacturing sector of all the manufacturing sectors in Canada. It is bigger than mining, it's bigger than machinery, it's bigger than things like wood and IT production. So it's an important sector for the Canadian economy. And finally, if you take a look just at economic activity of agriculture and agri-food sectors, it's about 7% of all of what we do in Canada. So this is interesting because on the one hand, we talk in terms of economics, and we have something called the Barton Report, and Diana already made reference to it. What is the Barton Report? Well, the Barton Report is this other hand of government saying, oh my goodness, agriculture is a pretty interesting thing. It's a pretty big engine. It could actually help us with our own economic and social well-being. So how are we going to do that? And there's a bit of a formula that says we're going to increase exports. And so Diana related to this, that there's kind of a national food policy on the one hand, and there's an economic growth strategy on the other. Are these two people talking to each other? And the thing is, if we have a national food policy, they have to talk to each other. So what does that mean? Well, it's important to not lose sight of the fact that we are a trading nation, and that it's a very significant part of our economic agricultural activity that what we produce, a lot of it is exported. And so if you come from Saskatchewan, there's just so much wheat you can eat, and after that you have to export it. So part of the access to food that my sister and brother-in-law have to their farm is producing enough lentils and oilseeds and wheat that they can sell it, and they have their own access to food that way. So I think it's very important to take a look at how our exports are increasing, and it is contributing to the well-being of Canadians and to our overall ability to make food. But this comes at only part of the picture, and if you just focus on the economic, which I think may have been one of the foibles of our analysis in the last 50 years, is that there's something else you have to focus on. It's not just about economic growth, it's not just about production, and in fact it is about whether we can increase our domestic production and use while, and it's a big while, conserving our soil, air, and water, and improving access to that food, and ensuring the public trust. Now that's a tall order if you're a producer, and it's a tall order if you're a consumer. So we do have to work together, we do have to talk together. And I liked a phraseology, I think maybe it was Lauren who said, we have to figure out how to link, to leverage, and to actualize. And I think that's the big challenge in governance and a governance policy, is that we want everybody to be at the table, but we have to realize that nobody gets everything that they may have hoped they would get when they walked in the door. So we really have to look for those opportunities for convening public dialogue. And I think events like this is exactly the kind of event where people are starting to think, how can we do this? How can we have a national food policy which facilitates the production of food, facilitates the safe and nutritious availability of food, and provides opportunities for the vulnerable to have better access to food. No small challenge, but that's what we're here to discuss. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Don. Okay, there it goes. I'll turn things over to Pat, an old friend, and with lots of experience. We've shared things over the years. Over to you, Pat.
Thank you for having me here. I must say, I'm really quite excited to be here, and I'm trying to think of some way to make this more controversial, because we're kind of all agreeing a bit too much here. So in a desperate effort to be controversial, I'll start off by saying that I think we don't need a national food policy in Canada nearly so much as we need the National Food Council. The policies keep on changing, and as you said, Don, a minute ago, that instant gratification isn't fast enough anymore. The Prime Minister in Davos earlier this year made a great statement in his speech. He said that things have never changed so fast, and they'll never be this slow again. And I think that's exactly right with our food system. Things are changing so rapidly that a food policy will be a constantly shifting thing, of course. It'll be a living thing, it'll keep on changing. What we need to have is a process in place which allows us to be monitoring that, being aware of those changes, and being able to react to them. To me, that's the vital thing. A food policy without a food council is pretty much useless, I think. It'll be a frozen target that won't get us anywhere very long. So the council is vital. And I'd like to approach it, though, from the experience I have, which is dealing with the international level issues around food and agriculture, and the work we've had over decades trying to create a similar body at the UN level. With, I think, a fair bit of success, not complete success, but it's still a work in progress as well. You remember, some of you will remember, not all of you, back in the 1970s when we had a world food crisis, and we had the first political conference on food in 1974 because of that crisis, and the result of that conference was to establish the Committee on World Food Security. They also created a World Food Council at that time. So the Committee on World Food Security was supposed to be an intergovernmental body that met with the UN agencies most concerned about food issues to try to monitor food as it went along each year to make sure we weren't caught in another food crisis as we were in the mid-1970s. The World Food Council was a council of ministers of agriculture around the world who got together to try to sort out their policy level concerns. Anyone who was involved in the UN in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s will know that both of those bodies were useless. The World Food Council finally was euthanized in the early 1990s. It had been dead for decades, but they finally formally killed it off or buried it. And the World Food Council never played a role of any kind at all. It met on an annual basis for about a week. It was the most boring meeting you could ever attend. I only went to the first one, which was lively, and after that it died off, and there was no point in going back. In the 1990s, we had another food crisis, and we had the World Food Summit, more importantly. And the World Food Summit was recognizing that it missed some kind of ongoing body to monitor food issues. And civil society at that time, supported by only one government, called for the creation of a new Roman Forum. That forum was to be a meeting of governments together with civil society and the private sector and the major United Nations agencies, most of them headquartered in Rome, but some elsewhere as well. They would come together on an annual basis to really negotiate the issues together. It didn't go anywhere at the World Food Summit. The one government, by the way, that supported this initiative was Canada. It was the only country that said, yes, we need to have this body created. But it came a bit too late in the process, and then finally it wasn't created. Then we had another food crisis, of course, back in 2007, 2008, and that did create the space for all kinds of complicated political reasons, which would be fun to talk about, but not in 7 minutes, that suddenly there was a recognition that the solution was to take the moribund Committee on World Food Security and make it, in fact, the new Roman Forum. And that's what happened. So suddenly, in the course of literally a few months, we moved from having no body internationally that we could address these issues to creating this committee, which was unique in the sense that it allowed for all the governments to be at the table, and they're the only ones that vote, but whoever votes in the United Nations anyways, no one does, but would allow for the governments to be there at the table, but also allowed civil society to be there, self-organized, together, putting themselves together to be participating at the table, equal with governments, and equally the private sector. So there's now something called a civil society mechanism and a private sector mechanism that are there at the table, able to present ideas, debate together with governments, and to really take on tough issues over the course of there's a 1 week of meetings every year. There's a long process of negotiation over the agenda items and preparatory work for those agenda items and resolutions and so on that come from that. And academia is there as well, the large working either with the private sector or with civil society mechanism, not particularly on their own, except for perhaps sometimes as observers. Now that body, again, came into existence in large measure, again, because of one country. This time it was actually the United States. It was the US that broke the logjam of negotiations and said, we need to have this kind of structure. It was the beginning of the Obama administration, and they were very open to it, and so it was created in a very quick time. Now, logic would have suggested at that stage that the Committee on World Food Security wouldn't, again, have gone very far. That people would say, okay, we don't want to have fights there, it's too public, too visible, we're staying away from it. And that was the fear. In fact, the committee every year has, when it's met, has been noticeable for several things. One, more people come each time, more corporations, more civil society partners, all the governments, more and more United Nations agencies. From the Rome-based agencies now, we have about 30 different agencies that drop in at least or participate in the meetings in the UN system. The other thing that's been noticeable is that the importance of the delegates has increased. More and more are coming from their capitals. More and more senior levels from the specialized agencies of the United Nations are participating. It's getting more attention every year. And thirdly, what time already? 1 minute. Okay. And thirdly, what we're finding is a willingness to, again, be flexible in addressing tough issues. And we've learned over the course of these last few years, the last decade of meetings, in fact, we've learned that it's possible for us to take on hot issues, really debate them out, and support each other in rather strange ways across all the categories. I've seen private sector and civil society cooperate together to persuade governments to make initiatives and change things. It's worked well. And we need to absolutely have to have that here in Canada as well. We need to have that same structure. And if I can just end with 2 points that are critical to this. One is, of course, it has to be open to all parties. It has to have all the actors at the table. Secondly, we have to recognize that stakeholders aren't in common. that we need to have facilitated access for those who are marginalized in the world, who don't get access to these means otherwise. Recognize that for one sector at the table, they're concerned perhaps about their future promotions. For others at the table, they're concerned about staying alive. Those aren't equal partners. And that's got to be acknowledged in the process of negotiation. But it's gone extraordinarily well. It's taken a long time to happen. It's only taken 150 years so far in Canada to have national food policy. Maybe it would be possible to have the council created much more quickly. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Pat. That's quite a journey in a short period of time. Peter, I'm just wondering if Catherine's ready to go, or would you prefer her to go last? Okay. All right. For me, some of the things that I've heard are going to influence what I have to say. I've had an interesting personal journey, and some of the things I'm going to talk about I was doing 50 years ago, and I haven't talked about them in 50 years. I grew up, a number of Algonquins ended up in, rather than residential schools, boarding schools in the US. There's a whole story behind that in Syracuse. A lot of us ended up working for the same construction company later on, et cetera. So part of my journey was that I spent a lot of time both sides of the border, but I did go to high school in New York State, and I was a Future Farmer of America. I was a 4-H member, but I also had my grandmother, an Algonquin midwife, influencing us about food, and fairly critical about industrial agriculture and the surrender of our capacity to gather food for ourselves. So we actually learned to eat muskrat, as kids. And I can tell you, if I told my friends that we ate muskrat, they'd look at me like I just landed from Mars. And if anybody was sick, she'd just go out in the backyard and pick this and pick that, and treat whatever malady needed to be treated. So I learned how powerful the land is, and it makes me think about various stories, parables, even biblical, that talk about the power of the land to take care of us, to feed us. So that certainly influenced me. But as time went on, I ended up studying agricultural science, including some of the things you're talking about, Don, in the State University of New York system, and then I transferred to the University of Illinois. I eventually drifted off in another direction, but never losing sight of growing food. And as a 5-year-old, I had a garden, and by the time I was 10, I was growing all the vegetables for my family in market gardening. And by the time I was 16, I was making a lot more money than I made since through agriculture. And I also remember a couple of things. I can remember fishing the St. Lawrence before the Seaway and how abundant it was in terms of fish and how clean the water was. I also remember agriculture before the advent of pesticides and herbicides and how we got the job done. But I also, because of where I lived, did variety trials and experimented with innovative technologies in association with Cornell University. But all the while, and when I think of some of the things that we did, how we handled those chemicals, when I think of my grandmother's teachings about water and the impact that we've had since then, it's a mixed bag. Because of that journey, I think there's a lot of questions that we have to ask as we recognize the impact on and the fact that Canada is a signatory to a number of international treaties like the Convention on Biological Diversity and climate change. And the third protocol, which is access and benefit sharing of genetic resources, occurred in 2010 in Nagoya, Japan. I was part of the Indigenous delegation then, and we talked about food sovereignty as part of our concerns. But suffice it to say that there wasn't even the ability to speak to each other. By the way, Canada was the last nation to hold out on having UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, incorporated in the preamble of ABS, and of course the HE targets, which include things like the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in all the other 19 international targets. So food fits in there, and from an Indigenous perspective and from a holistic outlook, you can't divorce food from species at risk, even forestry. I sit on the Ontario Professional Foresters Association Council, and I have to share my experience with forest management plans where there's a system in which communities can put forward a cultural values paper. Ours was loaded, one that I wrote, loaded with the importance of the forest to our food sovereignty. So when you're coming from such a different orientation around the relationship to food, and it's also our belief, and there's some great books that have come out in the last few years that recognize that relationship to food. In fact, it's been studied and proven some of those plants actually respond and do better when the relationship is maintained than if those plants are ignored and that relationship is severed or put in abeyance temporarily. Braiding sweetgrass is a great one. It's by a Potawatomi botanist named Robin Kimmerer. I highly recommend it. Avoiding controversy, Pat, I like your idea, though, of the fact that a council first. And it makes me think about Pathways 1, which is Canada's response to protected areas. You're going to hear about it real soon. You've already heard about a $1.4 billion financial announcement. And you're going to, I can't tell tales out of school. The recommendations have to go to ministers first. But some of these issues will be looked at. And what resonated when Pat said, council first, policy maybe. I know Dr. Reg Crowshoe, the lead elder for the process, created a co-governance model, and it had Indigenous, oral, and Western business. And we actually launched the three sectors, the steering committee, the Indigenous Circle of Experts, and the National Advisory Panel. One time we got together and we went over on Maple Island, excuse me, where the Rideau flows into the Kitchissippi or Ottawa. And we did a pipe ceremony in which everybody was there. And everybody later on in debriefing through the journey of the process reflected on how important that was in bringing us together. Not only our minds, our hearts, the physical world and the spiritual world. And it's through that unity, through drawing those four sources of intelligence and finding a way in the relationship with Indigenous peoples that gets away from the colonial model of being a stakeholder. And what happened in 1982 was recognition in Section 35 that Indigenous peoples have a history, cultures, sophisticated ways of knowing that predated contact. And so there's a recognition in sharing this land that there are certain obligations that had to be enshrined constitutionally. And so therefore, any governance model has to reflect that reality. And so Indigenous peoples need to be able to sit down and look at co-governance, just like the Pathways 1 model incorporated. There's actually diagrams. Dr. Croshu has written papers on it. One of them's the Alberta Energy Regulator. Now that sounds real sexy, right? But actually it's loaded with just good advice on co-governance. And so for me, yes, I agree, Pat. It comes to setting up that council and considering those co-governance values. As I've looked at the slides today and the partners, I see I'm happy to see that there are a variety of partners, but I still don't see a model that brings Indigenous in. Now I know the door has been open, and I know in part Indigenous peoples have said, wait a minute, we're still getting ourselves organized. So that's a factor. But ultimately, for food policy in Canada to be effective, we have to look at the reality of the entire landscape we know as Canada. And even within Indigenous cultures, and I'm involved in this fascinating national Indigenous education process called Landscape of Nations 360 Degrees with leading historians, educators, etc. So one of the things that we're learning about we're all learning from each other, but of course we're learning about food and how important it was and is to cultural integrity, to our relationships. And so I'll wrap things up by saying that I would encourage the architects of a council to consider what has been learned in the Pathways 1 model. And there will be very prescriptive recommendations about how to achieve cross-cultural governance for conservation. But I would argue that it's equally applicable to food policy in Canada, and it actually speaks to international objectives as well. So I look forward to the questions and answers that we'll have, and to Catherine's commentary. So Catherine, with great pleasure, I turn things over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for accommodating me on the line. What's been really fun and exciting is also sitting here at my computer at Dalhousie University and being able to see and engage this exciting online conversation that's happening here. I know you can see some of the comments coming in. So I wanted to start with a little bit of what I heard, and then I couldn't resist, of course, putting in my own 2 cents on some of these questions that Peter and Diana raised for us as contributors to the panel. So first of all, we heard that food is by itself complicated, and food policy is complicated, and food governance is even more complicated on top of that. We heard also from Diana that we've been talking as well as being really practical and creative and also critical about the issue of food policy and food governance for quite some time in Canada. So that's a challenge, because we've been having this conversation for a long time, but it's also a real opportunity that we have a policy window of an opportunity to allow these conversations to crystallize. We heard from Dawn that change is getting faster, and that trade-offs are something that we really need to keep in mind when we're thinking about reconciling all of the diverse inputs that go into food policy making, as well as into a discussion around a food policy council. And we heard from Larry about the importance of embracing that spirit of shared cultural diversity, and also recognizing, I think, where Indigenous and diverse leadership can lead the way for us. We heard from Pat that we don't necessarily need a national food policy so much as we maybe need a national food policy council. I really like that provocative opening, and you could, if you could see the comments online, you know, a few comments sprung up right away after that. And we also heard from Pat that we need to address structural inequities in how diverse individuals and groups participate, or maybe have not so much participated in the policymaking process to date. So, and finally, we heard from Lauren, and it's, you know, it's been such a pleasure for me to have a chance to listen to Lauren again, from whom I've learned so much over the years. But I loved your phrase, Lauren, of harnessing the collective intelligence of these conversations that we've been having. So just to prompt kind of the rest of the conversation and to react and reflect a bit, I was thinking to myself, you know, what is the purpose of a national food policy? And I think this is where we get to the potential idea that it's the council that's more important than the policy itself. A national food policy doesn't actually need to satisfy all, because, you know, food by itself can't make economic relationships more fair, and it can't by itself address structural inequities that have already existed in our food system and in our economic systems and in our political systems. But good governance can. And this is why the job of a food policy council, in terms of being a forum for those types of conversations, is really interesting and intriguing to me. Another aspect of the innovative nature of a food policy council is around this idea of where a national food policy, the job of it is not really to you know, set all of the parameters, but really to set national principles for the activities that are happening in provinces and localities, municipalities and regions. And we know that food policy, like the proving ground for food policy worldwide, has been local action. It's been municipal and regional action. And to the extent that a national food policy or a national council can set the stage and have this enabling role in allowing local actors to strengthen their food systems in the way that they want and that they need, and that incorporates models of co-governance and bottom-up policymaking, then I think that's really the power of a national food policy council. So to that end, some of the potential mandates of a food policy council that Diana raised in terms of being, I see them really as divided into two sets of activities. One of them is really around the alignment, the consensus building, even the benchmarking, research and engagement and fostering dialogue really fits well together under, I think, a council mandate that could exist within kind of existing governance norms. But the innovative or perhaps challenging part of this is the portions of the mandate that relate to support and coordination for local actors, where it encompasses, I think, financing, grants, contracts, and these other types of issues. So I think to really kind of wrap it up, the idea is that a national food policy and a national council can create room for the individuals and groups who don't necessarily see themselves well represented in that existing kind of siloed way of doing food policy nowadays. The food policy also needs to look outward in terms of setting Canada in place as a leader for food policy, you know, in relation to trade, but also in relation to creating that domestic governance room for innovative policymaking. So for example, aligning nutrition aims with sustainability aims. But again, I see that also as perhaps more of a council aspect than the policy itself. I have some specific opinions on the issue of being of a Canada Health Act and a Canada Food Act, but I'll just set that aside maybe for the conversation later. And my final point is that the power of food, as we can see in this conversation today, is that it helps us to have these tough and formative conversations about how we can draw on these diverse levers simultaneously to have the society we want. Thank you.
Kathy, that's great. I'm going to very quickly just open things up to questions and answers. First from those of you who are in the live audience, and then shortly thereafter, we'll turn it over to those questions that are pouring in. So is there anybody here that wants to start things off?
Hi everyone, my name is Eric Chourette. I work with Interpares, and a lot of discussions around national food policies around domestic food policy, and I'm wondering if there's room in this national food policy to also consider coherence between what we're doing domestically with what's promoted internationally. So a lot of NGOs are supporting small farmers across the world in terms of peasant agriculture, biodiverse agriculture. And then when I hear the Barton Report, it seems that it's favoring a very large-scale industrial approach to export agriculture. So it seems that there's not a lot of coherence between some of the work that is supported internationally and what we're promoting domestically. And how do we make sure that in those diverse voices of a National Food Policy Council, that we also address the international impact of Canada?
Panel?
Oh, I bet we all have something to say about that. I do very much think that the national food policy should strive for coherence in its domestic and international mandates. And I think that's a big problem right now. I think where some of the discussions have gone to is there's going to be, you know, a diversity of agricultural models that are going to receive domestic support as we gradually transition to something that is more sustainable in our food system. But the challenges are many. In fact, there's a great op-ed by Sophia Murphy in yesterday's Hill Times that underlines some of these issues. They're playing out in a million ways. There's an article earlier this week in the New York Times that the new negotiating position of the United States in the NAFTA negotiations is to have no labeling on junk food. And we know that there's a big front of pack labeling initiative headed up by Health Canada that is going to put labels on foods that are high in sugar, salt, or saturated fats. So I think you know, these contradictions will play out in many, many ways. But just to state one of the other sort of fundamental contradictions, how can we say that internationally a big focus of our food security and food systems priorities is to support smallholder agriculture and so on, and have that be such a tiny little marginal piece of the new Canadian Agricultural Partnership, where I think it's receiving $5 million out of $3 billion is devoted to that sort of very niche market. But I'm sure everybody else has lots to say about that.
Go ahead, Pat.
Okay, well, if I can just say at the beginning very quickly that I'm not against a national food policy. I'm all in favor of a national food policy. But
it's already been tweeted out.
but it's going to be a national food platitude if we don't have a council backing it up. We don't actually have an ongoing dialogue. So these just have to be together. That's all. And of course, nationally, what we do nationally and internationally have to fit together, and I see them fitting together. It's absolutely essential. We're right now in the midst of discussions over Canada and the United States are negotiating now over whether they will allow the Bayer-Monsanto merger. And everyone's thought of the Bayer-Monsanto merger as being one around seed prices. It's not. The negotiations is taking place, and the one that's been taking place in Brussels as well has been over technologies. It's been over who controls data. With Bayer and Monsanto both saying, we'll give up our seed, we'll give up our pesticides, we will not give up our data. Mm-hmm. That's what counts. And that no one would have thought of that 5 years ago. It's a moving target policy. It's one where you've got to be watching that, and you've got to be watching it at the global scale. Anything less than the global scale, and you're in trouble. So we have to be mindful of that. We can't exist in isolation. We've got to be addressing that question, and we've got to be aware that the implications of some of the things we're dealing with, some of the changes in technologies, are much wider than we thought they were 5 years ago.
Thank you.
So,
go ahead, Dan.
Sure, I just don't know if we all need to answer the question, but yeah, absolutely, Eric, I agree. And you know, what comes to mind is actually work that we're doing and others, including IPES, the IPES Food Panel on which Pat sits, work that's being done around transitions. So, and this is, you know, a global transition that needs to be underway, right? I don't think it's necessarily underway towards sustainability, toward equity. And so how do we work in coalition with others to do that? And through a National Food Policy Council, there should be room for both thinking about the policy coherence between domestic and our you know, international kind of foreign cooperation policy, but also thinking about how to bring some of the incredible work that's happening in other countries to the table and into the Canadian context to generate new ideas. So that is you know, it has to go both ways now in terms of north-south, the north-south dynamic that's really disrupted, and we have to think about a global transition from industrial towards sustainability, from small scale farming towards sustainability, from public and private sector towards sustainability. So together, you know, what does that look like, and what are those pathways? You know, they're individual kind of pathways, of course, that need to be defined but shared.
So I just want to add just a very specific example that is very much in the forefront of what our thinking at CAPI is. We would be hoping that the dialogue with National Food Council would be around sustainable food. And once you talk about sustainable food, the food doesn't just stay in one place. It radiates out, it radiates in. So when you're looking at a sustainable food, you have to take a look at all of the considerations with respect to the production of that food. And many of the ways that we're producing food around the world have unpriced externalities attached to them. So we're basically draining aquifers in some places. Canada has a particular natural capital advantage. And so maybe it's time that we start identity preserving some of the production that Canada has and saying this is just more sustainably produced than what you can get from country X or country Y. And so I think that kind of a dialogue would certainly be appropriate at a table that happened in Calgary or Ottawa. That was where the National Food Policy Council was meeting. It's become too big. The world is too small and the issue is too big to separate it into national and international. I think we would have to envisage a council that tackled the food issues, and they don't know borders.
Okay, I'm going to wade in too. Can't avoid it. And maybe I've taken liberties with Pat's comments, so I'll take ownership myself. And that's any council that hasn't addressed the co-governance model, that hasn't embraced the contemporary learnings that we've shared about setting things up so that cross-culturally we're addressing diverse approaches to our food needs is simply going to fail from my perspective. So the discussion around governance has to precede the policy discussion. Otherwise, you've shut the door. You're doing it linearly. You're doing it. You're segregating inadvertently, not consciously, but that's what the result will be. And I think that would be a huge mistake. Okay, I'm seeing people line up. I also know we have some online questions. I'll take the next question, and maybe we'll alternate after that. I'll check with Amanda after the gentleman who's at the mic now. Go ahead.
Thank you, Larry. So my name is Donald Lafleur. I'm with the Canadian Labour Congress and have been involved with the Food Secure Canada since 2005. Kathleen Brewster and other sisters and brothers, and I'm a descendant of Franco-Ontarian farmers from Moose Creek. So the issue is close to my heart. Panel was great. I always learn so much at these things. But I want to talk about sustainable food systems in the context of workers' rights. So, you know, Peter talked about from farm to fork. Well, from farm to fork, there's workers at every step of the way. And I want to take the time to mention, you know, the agriculture workers, including migrant workers and temporary foreign workers, transportation, grocery stores, restaurants, from the chef to the service at the table, elder care, even child care. So my question is basically, and I know you've done that, Diana, with Food Secure Canada. We had a migrant worker panel at Ryerson in Toronto in 2016. I think it was the first in Canada. So how are we going to make sure that workers' rights are protected and improved through both the policy and the council? Thank you.
Well, maybe thanks, Donald, for that. It's great to see you here. We've had a really deep and extensive involvement with the UFCW throughout the elaboration of these proposals, and several other trade unions have also signed on. So I invite you and your colleagues at the Canadian Labour Congress to sign on as well to the recommendations and get more deeply involved in the conversations that'll be coming up at the Assembly. But it is actually 1 in 8 jobs in Canada, to the best of my knowledge. So it's a huge economic sector, and a good number of people who are working in the food system actually live with some form of food insecurity because they don't have the high quality unionized stable jobs that I know the Canadian Labour Congress and other colleagues defend. So I completely agree.
I'll just jump in here. Through my work with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, we recently commissioned actually IPEST and co-launched a report on the health impacts of food systems called Unraveling the Food Health Nexus. And in that report, of course, labor figures centrally. And if you look at the health impacts across the food system, you know, one of the key channels for negative health impacts is through people's experience working in food across the food chain. So I think this is a central point. It relates to wages, but it relates to the conditions of work in you know, processing facilities, in agriculture. The most vulnerable workers globally are, of course, in agriculture and food. And so, you know, without considering this, we're missing a whole part of the conversation around food insecurity and health, as well as sort of the economic issues in between. So thank you for raising that point. I think it's a really important consideration, and it relates to, again, that kind of international solidarity work that we need to do.
Can I just mention that there's a report outside too by the IPES Food on corporate concentration in the food system titled Too Big to Feed. And one of the things we looked at was the impact on food workers of corporate concentration in agribusiness. And the figure I recall offhand is that there's about 40 million food workers in North America. And in the United States, 40% of them need food stamps to eat, which is outrageous. And so we've got to look at that on a global scale for sure. And they're impacted by all these changes.
So I'll just add that we're presently going across the country doing workshops on what the Barton Report means in terms of agricultural production, and if in fact the Barton Report objectives are met, which is to increase exports by 50% in the next 10 years, what's that going to mean for Canadian society? What's that going to mean for Canadian natural capital, water, biodiversity, but also what's it going to mean to the social fabric? And so in our dialogues, we're trying as much as possible to include voices that might not other be at the table. So we just had one in Guelph on Wednesday, and we had somebody, for example, from the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And those voices often, they, like all of us, we work in our silos, but we don't often talk to each other. So just hearing your question in relation to this panel on food policy was almost the same way as we heard that question for the first time in production agriculture. And we've just got silos that we have to break down if we're going to get to a coherent policy or an inclusive council, or both.
Okay, one quick comment, and that's the ILO, the International Labour Organization, actually predates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and affirmed the provision associated with self-determination. It actually Paul Joff, who is a lead lawyer with UNDRIP, reminded me that the self-determination components of UNDRIP, if I can use the acronym, are a product of partnerships with the International Labour Organization. Okay, Amanda, would you like to come up? How do you want to put forward those questions that are emerging from our many participants online?
Yes, I first just want to give a shout out to those folks online. We had some technological difficulties for the first 15 minutes and they hung on and they persevered, which I think is really a testament to how important people, think this conversation is. So thank you to everyone joining us from across the country. So there's been a lot of conversation and chatter on the chat box around questions of representation and diversity within the Food Policy Council. I know it's something that all of the panelists have alluded to, but a lot of interest in this question of sort of how and what is that going to look like. So both in terms of who is sitting around that table in terms of particularly Indigenous representation, in terms of ecological farmers, in terms of workers, civil society groups, and so how do we ensure those who are most affected by the food system at present are really at the center of that decision making, and also parallel to that, concerns around the degree to which sort of industry and sort of corporate food, how big is their seat at that table going to be, and how do we have those two so there's not a tension there.
Go ahead. At the global level, I mean, it certainly was a concern that there was an alarm that we kept on hearing from particularly the private sector, but also from governments, that we need to have all the stakeholders at the table. And civil society came back and said, well, there are stakeholders and there are stake eaters. And the stakeholders are those whose lives depend upon the negotiations. The stake eaters tend to be from the companies. And we have to recognize that, yes, they all have to be at the table, but they are not equal. And we have to create an environment in which there can be a genuine dialogue among all those parties. And that, I think, has happened. The civil society mechanism functions extremely effectively to get a voice out there. They're supported by governments, not adequately, but somewhat, so they can participate. So we have Indigenous peoples at the table. We have peasant organizations at the table. We have fisher folk at the table. We have food and agricultural workers at the table, all negotiating. And they are very effective in that negotiation. So the private sector was at this rather slow catching on to how important this was. In the initial meetings, the first years, there weren't many of them around. Suddenly they realized, oh my gosh, policies are being made here. So they show up in strength with wearing their boots. And it's been a good dialogue. I've been in meetings where at 2 o'clock in the morning, suddenly we're seeing an agreement struck between La Via Campesina, the peasant organization in the world, together with the US government supporting each other in a resolution. That doesn't happen very often. And I've seen private sector people, particularly from the smaller companies, cooperating and saying, yes, we can agree with that. We can do that together. Let's agree on this approach together. That does happen. So collaboration can be achieved. And it's a very dynamic environment. It's active, it's creative, it's respectful. It is respectful. And it can work. So yes, I see the reason to be concerned about having, the big guys, the Cargills and the Nestles and the Monsantos, or whatever Monsanto finally becomes, Demon Santo or something, at the table. But whatever it is, they still cooperate, and things get done.
I'd like to comment on that too. I mean, I think those are really, really critical issues, and I don't think any of us have the answers of that now. So the groups that have signed on to this proposal have not signed on to anything regarding more precisely the mandate, the membership, the appointments, or the access that people would have. So that is a job that we need to do collectively, and that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion today, and we intend to pursue it on repeated webinars and other occasions so that we can keep deepening how we're going to do it, because you know, I think there's a lot to be said for it's open and anybody can come, but at the same time, you need the same group of people who are going to keep showing up.
Sure.
And you need, if you're going to actually have some power within the process, there's got to be some kind of government appointment, board of directors, criteria for drafting that would need to be put in place. And there are many, many interesting organizational models for how that could happen. It could be some bottom-up governance model that would take what's happening at the municipal level. We could have an Indigenous circle of experts, as Larry has evoked. There's, you know, maybe things to go get in the pathways. There's the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. There's institutions like IISD or Rights and Democracy. So there's many, many models out there, and I don't think we yet have the answer. But I would just say on behalf of Food Secure Canada, every suggestion is welcome on how we go forward. And if the government does announce, and maybe someone from government will want to intervene, that they are creating a council, will that be we're creating, you know, a working group to work on this, the mandate and so on, or will it be a decision that is already made? I don't know the answers to those questions, but we'll sure be paying attention.
Well, just very briefly from the municipal experience, and in particular my own experience in Toronto, I mean, this is of course a central question around how to facilitate and enable the right people to be around the table. And this is an evolving process as well. So it's fluid and it, you know, changes with reports brought to council annually. And that membership matrix, so to speak, is constantly updated and revised based on, you know, the best thinking of the council members around the table who are considering membership and considering the slate of membership to be taken to the Board of Health. But I think also, you know, just to remember that there are all sorts of places out there where we have participation, deep participation on some of these issues, and it's about how to kind of tap into those existing conversations. And I'll just give one example. The City of Toronto's poverty reduction strategy has a lived experience advisory committee. So, you know, at a panel on food access this week, you know, someone was speaking from that panel, and that perspective is so important. And then, you know, again, how can that be facilitated to come into the Toronto Food Policy Council, but also, you know, into wider conversations. So I think there are, you know, places where access and the conversation is already happening. So how do we just tap into that expertise and bring it up into the conversation at different levels, whether it's provincial or federal in terms of the food policy conversation?
Okay.
My name is Miles Frost. I used to run something called the Canadian Agri-Food Marketing Council. I'd like to get into a very specific, get your personal views on one specific part of the way in which the council would work. Canadian Agri-Food Marketing Council did bring together a number of voices that might have been perceived as adversarial, conflicting groups, not nearly as broad a range as would be the case with the National Food Policy Council. So we were dealing just with large food manufacturers, small food manufacturers, export-oriented primary producers, those who were more concerned with the domestic market, those who were more concerned with local small production, those who ran some of the largest farms in Canada, multinational firms that were based in Canada, Canadian firms, a number of whom have been engaged in the National Food Policy Council discussion. We reported to two ministers. We were relatively effective on the federal provincial side. One of our constraints, and it was the same case with something I ran out of Foreign Affairs many years ago. One of our constraints was the need to keep relatively secret the discussions that went on around the table, precisely because there was this conflict amongst the various groups. And individuals had a difficult time taking off their institutional hat and using simply their personal experience, their knowledge that they had acquired. So on the council, one would have to think to the extent to which, that is picking numbers here, there are only, let's say, 30 members. There will be conversations that go on amongst those 30 members, but there are thousands of individuals who want to participate and want to hear. Any views, and I'm thinking about this now, but any thoughts that you may have on the way in which you can balance the need for discussion within the group, because there is conflict, there will be conflict, and the need to keep others outside of the group feeling as if they are part of it, that they're in. And I think a good example would be with respect to the What We've Heard report. There are many individuals who have contributed to that, and this is no conflict against Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I can understand why they might be holding it back. But there is a sense then, okay, we are not part of this discussion. We are simply going to receive something, decisions will be made. So how to balance that? Keep people engaged, and yet still within the confines of the group, be able to work out some of the differences. It's hard. And the success of the council over the long term, let's say 10, 20 years as it moves forward, will be dependent upon finding that balance. So it's just a thought that's going through my head, and I want to share it because it's something we might discuss.
Thank you. Panel?
So I can jump in on that one, and only to say that's a very, very, very good question. When you have the answer, come back to us. But let me give you some anecdotal evidence that I've seen, and this might be a very optimistic, rose-colored glass response. Just looking at the consultations that happened between June and September, October, November, there were people in the room together at the beginning that had quite a lot of difficulty being in the room together, and there was, by the time September, October, November rolled around, there was a new appreciation for walking a mile in each other's shoes. And that was a really encouraging thing. I don't know if I'm being overly optimistic, but one should not poo-poo the progress that I think we have made simply by having the discussions and the process. So will it be successful? Will it be easy to figure out who that group is? Will it be easy to allow for the voices who are not that 30 or 50 or whoever whatever number you pick to be heard and feel heard when it's such a complex issue? That's a very, very difficult question. And so the one second piece of encouragement, I think, is that there's a new imperative to get this right, because not only are we trying to get to a place where we have a cohesive food policy, but it's not just the people who are producing or the advocates who are asking for it, it's the consumers, and there's 36 million of us. So there's a new heightened awareness of what food is and what role it plays, and you see that in the newspapers and the magazines and the frequency with which food comes up as a subject and as a cultural signpost. So I'm encouraged by that, and we do have to keep it inclusive. And if we lose that exclusivity and if we go back to our silos, I think we're lost.
Thank you, Don.
I would just, I agree that it's a very good question, and there's some tricks of the trade, a sort of Chatham House rules or that kind of thing that could be done. But I do think it's really important to err on the side of transparency and openness, and keep the confidential conflicts and those kinds of things outside the formal proceedings would be my inkling. But I think it's a really good question and a debate we have to have. I also think that each sector will have to develop its own mechanisms of accountability. And, in some instances, those are very straightforward Robert's Rules type things. In some instances, for example, in the commodity groups or the industry roundtables, they're already sort of set up. For others, like civil society or for Indigenous peoples, it's far more challenging to develop proper mechanisms of accountability. And resources have a lot to do with that. So I think there's got to be rotating. We have to avoid the you know, you sit for 5 years and then you renew twice kind of phenomenon, so it doesn't get stale. And so that, and I think we have to also look at the collective intelligence of the group, the kind of matrix approach that Lauren talked about, that we all bring different experience and different values and different connections to the table. And it's the collective intelligence of the group that will make it work or not, I think.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it's very important for the council itself to be open, and of course issues of tension or divergence are going to arise, and I think that that's actually where that's when then a working group is struck to work some of that through and consult, you know, beyond the group to understand the issues in a deeper way. So I feel like there are ways that groups can work through this, but it's absolutely true. And that's where some of the most interesting conversation can take place. I mean, I'm thinking of the conversation around food waste, for example, in Toronto. It's actually a very contentious issue, how we address food waste, through legislation, et cetera. So how do you bring, we have spent a lot of time bringing stakeholders to the table, understanding people's interests, and looking at how other jurisdictions were dealing with this to, discuss ways forward and specific opportunities that we wanted to bring to council. So these aren't interesting issues, but that hard work has to be done. It's the, as you know, it's the kind of interesting part of these kind of councils, multi-sectoral conversations.
I think the transparency is really vital, but I think there's a distinction between whether the body, the council is established to put down regulations and law, rules, or it's there to give advice. And if it's there to give advice, that's really a different thing in terms of need for secrecy or confidentiality. We learn in the Canadian food security that things don't have to be legally binding to be politically binding. It's really the political import behind the consensus that's established in the meeting that counts. If there's a lot of weight behind it, then it really counts for a lot with the governments. If it's a divisive final view, then it has less weight with the governments. And it's not really that it's written in law afterwards. It is that's the political intent of the body. It makes a real difference in the willingness to be flexible.
Thank you. Okay.
One last one?
No. 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 We're down to about 7 minutes. There's 2 more voices behind you. And in fact, I'm going to ask the panel to keep our responses brief so we can hear from both these women. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I'm Manuel Rangel from the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Great presentation today. I would venture to say that for a lot of health groups, I think a lot of the objectives of a food policy make sense. Health groups would be behind them. Venues for encouraging dialogue, breaking down silos, funding organizations that work in food security, creating benchmarks, monitoring process, the creation of an advisory council, national principles, and also co-creation and involvement, meaningful involvement by Indigenous peoples. That's very, very critical. All good stuff. I think the one concern I would say that potentially for health groups would be if there was ever a thought of creating a vetting structure, for example, at PCO, that would determine what food policy initiatives move forward. That would be a concern because multinationals could definitely have a huge influence there. They have a lot of money to lobby. And as Diane mentioned, we're seeing that right now in the NAFTA negotiations. The multinationals have been successful in getting the Trump administration to put a draft proposal on the table to prohibit front-of-package nutritional labeling. So anything that could impede Health Canada's ability to put forward these public health interventions, I think would be a big concern for a lot of health groups. But 99%, I think, of what is being proposed, I think most health groups would support, but I would just put that caution there. And just love to hear any thoughts from the panel on that.
Well, I think I think it should have appeared in the slide, Manny, when it said to enhance intergovernmental coordination while respecting the specific mandates of different government departments and agencies. I think that was sort of at the heart there. It's not that we're, you know, going to open up the doors and say, okay, well, what should the Canada Food Guide look like? And y'all come on down. So, you know, tricky. It's a little bit like Miles' question. Tricky territory to be worked out collectively and very, very carefully and thoughtfully. But it would be fantastic to have more health groups on side on the proposal.
Please, we've got about 4 minutes.
Okay, very quickly. I'm Professor Heather McLeod-Kilmurray from the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. And I had two, one is process and one is substance. And a lot of it's been said already, which is great. So in terms of process, who's going to be involved? And we've talked about the role of industry, but if industry is going to be inside this, is there also some effort? Do we need to lobby about lobbying? Do we need to lobby about lobbying rules so that there, you know, within we may get lots of equality and representation, but competing against those loud voices? I think that's something that's been mentioned. And then within, just some other ideas about who hasn't been mentioned. I think youth as an interest group, just as a professor, a lot of the students, there's a lot more interest I find from the young people, and so do they need to be represented? Gender as well, I think at our food conference, there was a lot of talk about a specific focus on gender too. And then from substance, Lauren talked about it, I wanted to, because Diana mentioned low-hanging fruit that everybody already agrees on. Is waste one of them? And can we see that from elsewhere? It seems that reducing food waste speaks directly to the need to constantly increase the growth of production, and it's very central to environmental sustainability. And I think that's my main point. Environmental sustainability still seems to be slightly an also would be nice as opposed to a necessity, and one of the 4 pillars. And I think we've moved to a nested view of sustainability with environment underpinning everything and not just one of the pillars. And I'm not sure that that's coming through in terms of ministry involvement, Ministry of the Environment, and as well as some environmental groups as well. What can we do to enhance that?
Does one of us want to answer that one? Lauren?
Why don't we hear the other question?
Agree. How's that?
Hi, I'm Galia Shaheen from Montreal. I'm the coordinator for the new Food Policy Council in Montreal. It's about to happen in about a month and a half, so I could only imagine the complexity of putting together something at the national level. But just to, in regards to the process that we're going through, and we've had some conversation, Diana, about this, just to say that while doing this in Montreal, we learned so much from the food policy councils that do exist, and perhaps referring to what you, Lauren, said about the tiered linkages, perhaps the national level could learn from other experiences that are happening elsewhere in the rural and the urban settings, which are very different but have the same issues. So that would be my, you know, if we can do something with things that Toronto has been there for years and other councils are doing an amazing job. So perhaps learning from what's happened, because it's the same thing scaled up and multiplied, of course. Another point that you mentioned about putting sustainable food as a center, and I think that could be perhaps a key way of dealing with some of the issues that were mentioned, is the way we approach it in Montreal is every single action or mandate that we take on has to be sustainable, but really sustainable. So in French we say environnementalement responsable, socialement équitable, économiquement viable, et culturellement respectueux. So it's like all the real pillars of sustainability are integrated in every single project and every single mandate. Of course, that's the vision. We'll see how it works out. But that kind of brings everybody around the same level, whether it be corporate or institutional, private or philanthropy or community groups. Everybody works towards that, whether it's a small scale project or a bigger scale project. If it fits the 4 aspects of sustainability, the real issues, it could perhaps solve some of the issues. So that's a challenge that we're putting forth in Montreal, and I hope perhaps if we can help out.
Thank you very much. Anybody want to respond?
I would just sort of link up the 2 comments, the last 2 comments, and that really what we're doing is that we've been siloed in our approach. And so we don't understand sustainability the same. It's not like sustainability changes. We haven't discovered the the wholeness of sustainability. And I think that's one of the gems that's coming out of this process, is that we are understanding that whether you're a producer, a consumer, or a vulnerable individual, there's something about wholeness and the food system that is central to your identity. And so from my perspective, it's about producers, and producers are saying, well, we don't want our land to be less productive. We want our land to be more productive. And so how do we get to that? And some of that is an economic incentive, and some of it is a recognition that there are some practices that are better than others. And so why wouldn't we pursue them, and why wouldn't other people want to hear about how we're improving their, the food that is available? So I think we're coming at this gem from different perspectives, different angles, but this allows us to be in the same room, and it's not something that's been the tradition. Traditionally, we've been in silos, whether it's in government or even in the private sector. It's been retailers against producer associations, and so we need to break down some of those walls.
I think, another way of thinking about the work of the council is to think about what are the principles that the council agrees on related to sustainable food system. And then you can evaluate the priorities that are selected for work against those principles. So, if we're looking for a food system that is more resilient, more equitable, more healthy, more diverse, then I don't know if those aren't necessarily the principles that this group would come up with, but what do we mean by saying that, and then how do we choose priorities against those? I think that in terms of the work, just to be really practical, I mean, the work as it will come onto the table of a National Food Policy Council will be both reactive and proactive. So there'll be things that the group can agree on to work proactively on. Food waste may be one of them, but there will be a whole suite of possibilities, and there'll have to be, some choices around what are sort of top priorities for the council. And then it will also be reactive. So what are the government's current priorities, whether that be, a national housing strategy or, something else that the council wants to engage in to bring their kind of thoughts and considerations and experience to and advise on the development of those policies. So this is, not only about a food policy in and of itself, it's about how do we integrate food systems considerations through our policy in Canada, whether it be environmental, social, et cetera. And the council can play a very interesting role to bring the considerations from around the table into those conversations and be a resource for developing those priorities and issues and policies.
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to say I'm glad to hear you talk about 4 pillars, the 4th one being cultural. I'm going to turn things over to Peter. If I have a minute afterwards, I'll say one thing in 60 seconds.
Well, I'm here to, I was going to have a few minutes to sum things up. I'll do that very quickly. What I really heard today is that we can bring diverse groups around the table, and it's amazing how much we can agree on. And I think, they're not all represented here, but if the slide that Diana put up of all the various producer organizations and food security groups and so on, who all signed on to that letter that went to government around the governance proposal, I think is indicative of how much agreement can be achieved. What I also heard is a lot of very practical suggestions of how to do it, how to, the conversation tended to focus on the National Food Policy Council, which is fine. And I think we heard from Lauren about the Toronto example and the municipal example and how that works in practice in terms of facilitating conversations, systemic framing, supporting policy development in practice. We heard from Pat about the Committee on World Food Security and how it's, it's drawing the states in and drawing industry and civil society's actors in because they see it as a place to have an important conversation. And then I also heard from Don, coming from the agri-food industry side and an organization that represents that says, these are the kind of cross-sectoral conversations that are important. We want to be part of the future, and a food policy that doesn't enable this is probably not going in the right direction. Finally, Larry, giving a very practical example, pointing out Indigenous people are not just stakeholders.
That's a colonial lens, and we have to be very careful about that in terms of how we construct this. And so offering the practical example from the Pathways experience that you're part of how you can have an Indigenous knowledge table group that's also integrated with the broader discussion. So not separate, but also integrated. And Kathy, really appreciate having her input coming from Dalhousie. I'm really sorry that she couldn't be here today. And finally, Diana also giving a model with rights and democracy. A few thank yous to Nicole Bedford, Amanda Wilson, the tech staff who are supporting us today, Ethan who did the poster, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada that provided some funding, the Office of the Dean of Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton, thanks to U of O, thanks to all of our panelists, and I pass it back to Larry for the last word.
Miigwech, Peter, very quickly. This is a replica of the Pledge of the Crown Belt. It was created by the Crown in 1815 at the conclusion of the War of 1812, a war in which Indigenous warriors, the total of lives lost exceeded the total of the Americans, the British and Canadian troops. And as I mentioned, the Crown produced this belt. Those parallel lines zigzagging represented our relationship, the expectation that there would be challenges. And the presenter, Sir William Close, said, it will be our love and affection that get us through those difficult times. But obviously a recognition of a parallel path, but a shared path. So I'll wrap things up that way. Happy to talk about that after we break. And I just want to say a big miigwech, or thank you to our panelists, to Peter, and to all of you who made this a rich and important dialogue today. Miigwech.